Revolution. First, we should remember the causes of the war itself. There are 5 things to remember about the causes of the American Revolution. First, we had the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. This war that took place in the 1750s fundamentally altered lots of things in the colonies, as well as the relationship between the colonies and Britain. The British expected colonists to fight in the war on the British side against the French and the Indians. As a result, a lot of have-not colonists were ripped away from their families, and their families were the ones facing the brunt of Indian attacks out on the frontier. So this really inflamed the passions of the have-nots, something that we know the haves in the colonies will later turn to their advantage. We also know that certain members of the colonial population ended up fighting in the French and Indian War on the British side and learned a lot about battle strategy, George Washington being the best example. He learned how to be a general during the French and Indian War. But the most important impact, I would say, of the French and Indian War was the debt that accumulated as a result. Because the British government had so many debts to pay off, they had no choice after the war but to raise taxes on the colonists. And that's going to be the biggest mistake they make in ultimately causing the American Revolution. Second cause to remember is that the colonies were not Europe anymore. We had an enormous influx of immigrants over the course of 20 to 30 years in colonial history, from the early 1700s up to the 1750s. So if you look at that 50-year period, the colonies more than doubled in size. And these are people that are coming from all over, not just from England. So this new American society is not just a British society anymore. It contains lots of different religions, lots of different ethnic groups, and it really created a whole new situation in the colonies that the British just didn't understand anymore. Third, we know that the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, as well as the Scientific Revolution, all of these new ways of thinking changed the way people looked at the relationship between government and religion and people who lived in society. So when you think about the Enlightenment, we're talking about people like John Locke, who argued everyone's born with life, liberty, and property. People like Voltaire, who said everyone's born with free speech rights. People like Montesquieu and Rousseau, who talked about the best kind of government to govern people is not a monarchy, but rather either a democracy or a government that has branches to protect different interests for different people in society. We also know that the Great Awakening was really desperately trying to hold people to religion, but more and more we saw people turning towards science. People like Sir Isaac Newton had revolutionized scientific thinking. The best American example, Benjamin Franklin, with his electricity experiments and his writings about scientific thought. So these 3 factors, the imperial conflict, the new society, and the different ways of thinking, laid the groundwork or created the soil that the final 2 factors are going to play into. And those final 2 factors, as we've talked about, were a combination of the British mistakes and the radical have politicians in the colonies who took advantage of those mistakes. So we know that the outbreak of the war really was a result of all 5 of these factors. The British start putting taxes in place, and as a result, people like Paul Revere, James Otis, Sam Adams, John Hancock, all who have something to gain by stirring up the have-nots, turn that anger against the British. The problem is, in creating this new idea of liberty, they've started a fire that they're really going to have a hard time controlling. So we know that the radicals have started this fire, this passion in the have-nots. They've turned that anger against the British, and we saw things like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, these things where now blood is being spilled between colonists and the English or British government. So as we look at this, it's important to sort of look at what is the political and military overview of the Revolutionary War itself. So I'm going to try to break it down for you in a really simple way. Our common